Christians point to other examples where the law has been changed to accommodate the rights of minorities.
A Hindu man has won the right to be cremated on a traditional funeral pyre.
A Sikh teenager from South Wales has won her right to wear a religious bangle to school.
It is true that a number of Muslims have failed to win the right to wear the full veil at work. Even so, many forms of religious dress are now permitted in the workplace. But even supporters of human rights legislation worry that when it comes to Christian expressions of faith, the law is not always applied evenly. In 2006, a British Airways check-in worker was told by bosses to cover up a small Christian cross.
All of a sudden, I'm annihilated. Christianity is nil and void.
The company said it went against its uniform policy.
The Sikh turban is allowed, the Muslim hijab is allowed, and this is not allowed. I'm just wondering how you're going to get yourself out of this hole that you've dug yourself into.
BA later changed its mind. But Nadia Awida wants to prove that the original policy was discriminatory. She's taken her case to several court hearings, but in February, the Court of Appeal ruled against her. British Airways say the decision yet again confirms that they acted appropriately and lawfully. Nadia Awida wants to appeal to the higher Supreme Court and is being backed by the human rights group Liberty. It's a supporter of equality and human rights legislation. But its director, Shami Chakrabarti, says the way the law was applied in this case seemed to be discriminating against Christian beliefs.
I think it's incredibly important that human rights and equal treatment protect everyone, and that we demonstrate that we apply these very important laws and these very important values with an even hand. Nadia Awida was not hurting anybody. There was no practical reason at all why she couldn't do her job perfectly well whilst wearing a small cross around her neck. And I thought it was the height of intolerant bureaucracy that she was prevented from doing that.
Some Christians do perceive an inconsistency. The Hindu is allowed a funeral pyre, the Christian woman is not allowed to wear a cross, and that really gets people angry.
I've been involved in cases on behalf of people who are members of different religions and of none. One boy was arrested for calling Scientology a cult. We've represented a girl who was banned from wearing a Sikh bangle to school. But I think there's a more general problem here, which is that sometimes people are failing to recognise that faith is a very personal matter, and what we need to do is only interfere when it's truly necessary, rather than trying to treat everybody exactly the same.
Liberty is calling for a level playing field, tolerance for all. But some Christians insist that has not been their experience so far.
But there are always going to be winners and losers in equality legislation. You cannot, by definition, surely have an entirely level playing field.
I think you can have an entirely level playing field. It is a matter of historical fact that the struggle for democracy in Britain has been intrinsically linked with the struggle for religious tolerance and freedom.
The very phrase, human rights is sometimes rather spat out by people, isn't it, who think it's, gone way too far and has lost any real meaning. But you were there, working as a lawyer in the Home Office in the year 2000, weren't you?
When I was in the Home Office at the time of the birth of the Human Rights Act, it was supposed to protect these very values of tolerance that we hold so dear in Britain. It was supposed to be the framework that we could all unite around and that would help us settle some of these differences and rubbing points that are sometimes inevitable in a diverse society. Now, lots of equality legislation has been very piecemeal, race and gender first, sexuality and religion many years later, but the Human Rights Act is supposed to protect everybody. Let's remember that it protects freedom of thought, conscience and religion too.
We also asked Trevor Phillips of the Equality and Human Rights Commission to comment on the concerns raised, but he was too busy to meet our deadline for an interview. Human rights legislation may have led to a raft of competing rights, but the goal of human rights law remains to make Britain a more, not less, tolerant society. But for many Christians, the issue still remains. They feel that their faith is being sidelined. And for some, this raises a deeper concern. When faith is removed from the public arena, inevitably, it leaves behind an ideological vacuum. The question is, what fills it? It's tempting to say enlightened reason, liberalism. But how good is it at taking the moral high ground? Well, on the face of it, you might think, very good. In the last century, the liberal voice of reason has spoken out against one form of exploitation or another. And yet history shows that the track record of enlightened reason is as blemished as that of faith.
When the French Revolution pushed out religion, the result was the Jacobin terror. When the Russian Revolution abolished religion, totalitarianism filled the void. The guiding principle of liberalism, a commitment to tolerance and live and let live, has an inherent flaw. It's less likely to counter strong competing ideologies, whether they're religious or not.
Of course, we live in different times, but Christians and libertarians alike agree that the French and Russian revolutions do show what happens when a liberal society does not complement reason with faith.
I think there are broadly three choices about how you deal with this small question of religion in any society anywhere in the world. The first choice is to say we pick one religion and it must dominate everything else. That's been Afghanistan under the Taliban, maybe even Britain in earlier centuries. The alternative that some people promote, that's to say that all faith is dangerous, divisive mumbo-jumbo, and we want to stamp it out altogether or chase it completely from the public sphere into the private sphere, under the bed with the pornography. And that, if you like, is my caricaturing of Stalin's Russia, but also to some extent parts of Europe, like France. The human rights democratic pluralistic approach that I support says that, you know, we are all as human beings partly creatures of faith and of reason, and we interfere with individual freedom and people's behaviour only when it's proportionate to protecting others.
Surely modern Britain is no longer at risk of totalitarian ideologies or fundamentalist religions. Well, I'm about to meet someone who thinks we are.
I'm on my way to meet the former Bishop of Rochester, Michael Nazir Ali. Now, he grew up in Pakistan and became the youngest bishop in the Anglican Communion. He left there in the 1980s because of threats to his family. He is never a stranger to controversy. He's spoken out on many occasions on what he believes is a threat we all face because of the marginalisation of Christianity. You've spoken, Bishop Michael, about the moral vacuum in our society, the drift in our society, and the possibility of extremism filling that space. How real a danger is that in your mind?
We are, for the first time since the demise of Marxism as an ideology, facing another very insistent, comprehensive ideology which is claiming to address economic, political, social, every aspect of life. That is Islamism. When people of different religions and cultures and indeed languages began to arrive in this country, they should have been welcomed here on the basis of Christian hospitality. Instead of which, of course, they began to arrive at precisely the time when the force of the Judeo-Christian discourse was being lost in the public square. And so multiculturalism was invented by default. The idea was, well, we don't really know where we've come from, or we are trying to forget it. We don't know who you are and where you've come from, so let us just continue to live our lives separately as best we can. Well, we've seen what the result was. The result was isolated segregated communities, not knowing one another. This certainly provided an opportunity for extremists to sell their own wares. We have no common view of citizenship, and we don't know how the different communities can contribute for the common good. At the moment, I welcome.
But other Christians are not so pessimistic about the outlook for society. Nick Spencer is Director of Studies at Theos, a theology think tank founded with the support of Britain's Anglican and Catholic churches.
I'm aware of the moral vacuum argument, the idea that Christianity was our moral atmosphere. It has removed or been vastly diminished. That leaves a vacuum, and therefore, for example, Islamism kind of spreads into it. I'm not convinced by it. It may be the case in some circumstances. I think you're right that sort of culture abhors a moral vacuum, and therefore, if we don't believe in something, we don't start believing in nothing, we believe in something else. I don't think that something else is extremism. For a start, I think that Christianity is not as much diminished as a kind of cultural artifact as people sometimes think it is. You only have to look at the last census to show that in some sense or other there is a very, very significant residual attachment to Christian identity in the British population.
If we're asking the question, are Christians being persecuted, we've also got to ask, what kind of society are we living in today? Because everybody, Christian or otherwise, we just want to live our lives as we see fit. But if we carry on like this, that could become harder. And if it does, what do we do about it? There will, of course, be many outside the church who will be happy to see Christianity consigned to the private sphere. And there are even Christians who feel that things are not as bad as their fellow believers claim.
I think Christianity both is and isn't being marginalised. There's certainly no persecution of Christians in this society in the way that there are in some societies around the world. And images of persecution, I think, are misplaced. The current government, the opposition, main opposition parties, have all spoken very positively about the role that Christianity plays in society, and in some senses are all falling over one another to work with voluntary organisations, and among them religious, Christian voluntary organisations, in the provision of public services on the ground. That certainly isn't marginalisation, that's partnership.
But for other Christians, there's still the problem of what they can do to make their voice heard. Ziadin Sadar is a supporter of equality and human rights legislation, but nevertheless, he thinks Christians should speak out for their beliefs.
I think Christians in Britain face a very specific problem. They are totally and utterly marginalized. In fact, they are being stereotyped, just like Muslims are being stereotyped. So the common assumption is that Christians are irrational. When they open their mouth, nothing of logic and common sense comes, I think if I was a Christian, I'd be very upset.
So where have Christians gone wrong and why? How did they, in sports part, how did they take their eye off the ball?
The Christians have kind of reduced religion to purely private matters to such an extent that they are now very reluctant to participate in public affairs. And that, I think,